Okay, welcome everyone to Poll 214, Political Ideas. We started last week. I talked generally about the course. Everybody knows that they have to download the Unit Information Guide. That's everything you need is in there. We started talking about Plato and Socrates. You will recall that Socrates was executed by the state. He was executed for corrupting the youth and for worshipping strange new gods. And for basically being seen as an enemy of the democracy. The people that were responsible for bringing the charges against him, one was a representative of the poets, and we'll talk at length about that today, because what is going on is a massive attempt to completely rechange the educational structure and the thought patterns of the Greeks, in which philosophy will be doing it. Another was a representative of the democracy, so a representative of the statesman. And another was representing the orators. And we will see that the orators and the poets in Plato, all three of those groups are all aligned in Plato. We saw that, as I said, Socrates was executed. He warned the Athenians that his execution would only open floodgates of philosophy. And to some extent that was quite insightful of him. We also said that Socrates never put pen to paper. He didn't write. That everything we know about Socrates comes from one of three sources, one of whom is a comic poet, Aristophanes, who represents him as akin to the sophists. I'll talk more about him today. But they were the wise guys teaching people all these skills that they could use to sway the crowd. And he is mentioned, as I said, in Plato's Apology for being the real accuser of Socrates. The other person that writes on him is Plato, or uses him as a mouthpiece. In most of Plato's dialogues, he's the primary mouthpiece, so we tend to associate what Socrates thinks and what Plato thinks as all of a piece. Though there is a big argument that goes along these lines. Socrates was a guy who always ended up saying, I don't know anything, whereas Plato comes across as a bit of a novel. In a sense, he answers all the questions, but he often puts those answers in Socrates' mouth. But there are other dialogues where Socrates is standing idly by, listening to people, which indicates that he is learning from other people, that he's caught up in dialogue, that dialogue is a very serious part of learning, and that he himself is open to instruction. And there's one dialogue where there's a character called the Athenian stranger, where Socrates doesn't appear at all, though Aristotle just assumed, and Aristotle was a student of Plato, Aristotle just assumes that the Athenian stranger is Socrates, but the text doesn't actually tell us that. We also said that Plato is really the first great political philosopher, certainly the one whose work we still have intact. And his great book, The Republic, in many ways it can be seen as a defense of the philosophical life, an identification of what that entails, an identification of the philosophical method, which is very closely related to what the philosophical life is. So what the philosopher does, how he goes about doing his business, and he mainly is contrasting the philosophical life, which is the best life, with what he sees as the worst life, which is the life of the tyrant. Now, what is interesting about that is that there is a tradition amongst the Greeks that indicated that although the Greeks actually hated being tyrannized by anybody, the aspiration to be a tyrant was seen to be widespread. And in fact, in one of Plato's dialogues, which is my favorite dialogue, it's a dialogue called the Gorgias, Gorgias, where he actually takes on the orators, and especially the major orator, and then two of his students, who is Gorgias, his great teacher of oratory in the ancient world. One of the characters in that basically makes the argument for the tyrannical life. His name is Callicles. So in the Republic, it's a book with multiple purposes. It is a book that's laying down the best kind of city-state, the best way of life for a person to live, which is to be a philosopher. We will see the best city-state is one that is run by philosophers. It is also a defense of Socrates in much greater detail than what we see in the Apology. And it's been called the real apology of Socrates. I think that was a very smart or an insightful comment. The dialogue is called the Republic, and res publica means what is of the people, what belongs to the people, but the public in that sense. It doesn't mean a democracy. And ancient republics weren't necessarily democratic, even though they were in Greece. But generally, like the Roman Republic, for example, wasn't particularly democratic. Its subtitle is On the Just. And so the search for justice is really what guides the conversation. It's a search for justice and a search for what we call virtue, or what is often translated as virtue. I might clear that up, it might come up again later, but I'll just say something about this word because another translation for it, one that has become quite widespread within academic self-promotion nowadays when you see it at universities, is the word excellence. You've all heard of that, striving for excellence. I nearly fell off my chair the first time I heard managers talking about excellence, because I grew up reading Plato and all this stuff, and no one spoke about excellence then. But in management theory, the word excellence started to appear, and it was quite obvious that the people that were designing these kind of theories had read some Plato, and basically were thinking of themselves along the lines of being philosopher kings, which is one reason I'm very suspicious of management and management theory. So that word excellence simply means, in this term, so the words virtue and excellence simply mean that something is functioning to its full potential. And when we get to Aristotle, we'll see that he analyzes this in more depth in a way than what Plato does. Plato is touching upon it in all sorts of ways, but when we get to Aristotle, we'll see the way he attacks the problem enables us to realize that everything, at least as Aristotle sees it, and I think, as I said, the idea is dormant in Plato, that everything has a potentiality. Something has the potential to be something. So you've got what is actual and what is potential. And the actual, in the classical sense, is when the potential is fully realized. So when you're speaking of virtue, stroke excellence, what you're talking about is a human being reaching their full capability. And that's what virtue means. It doesn't mean morality quite in the more modern sense of simply doing the right thing, according to a principle of reason, for example. Although, in a way, it's similar, because what we see with Plato, what we see with Aristotle, what we see with the classical philosophers, is the belief that we should take our guidance from reason, from intelligence. And I think I mentioned to you last week that that is seen as part of the soul. There's a rational part of the soul, a reasonable part of the soul. And that should rule the soul. We'll come back to that. So the search for justice is actually a search for something that people generally agreed was a virtue and was something worth having, worth striving for, a potential that is worth having in one's own soul. And yet, as he explores it, remember what I said about Callicles defending the life of the tyrant. As he explores it, what becomes very clear is although the Greeks like the idea of justice insofar as they want to live in a just community, they don't necessarily want to be just themselves. And so this argument is very much based around that idea. Is justice in and of itself very good? Is it a good thing? And that's a word you're going to hear, and it's central to Plato, and he uses the word in a way, that the word is goodness, or the good. And we don't normally speak about the good. We don't make a noun of goodness. It's usually used adjectively, isn't it? Something is good. That person is a good person, etc. But in this case, with Plato, he takes the idea of goodness and he turns it into an idea in and of itself. And that then becomes the touchstone for his analysis of virtue in general and of justice in particular. Has everyone got that? That's clear enough. So, one of the things that was common to all the dialogues in which Plato appears, especially what's called Plato's early dialogues, well, I mentioned that last week, where in these dialogues Socrates goes around asking people what is something. That's the great question. To see if people had a definition in which, remember me talking about the one and the many. The one big idea would be able to be encapsulated by the definition. So you wouldn't just give examples to say, well, if I said, what is courage? You'd say, well, at the battle of, or some battle, Themistocles displayed this great courage there. And Socrates goes, no, that's an example. I want to know what it is. And then I can look at what it is, and then I can compare it. So if I know what it is, then I can tell what they're doing, what someone does, whether or not it fits the idea. So you try to find something stable, because we have all these examples which are differentiated. There are many things, and we're trying to find a way to group them together, because if we can group them together, then we can make an argument and we can make sound, rational claims. Is that clear? You got that?
Yes.
Okay. I love the concentration, but I hope I'm not terrifying you. Okay. So, when the Republic opens, Socrates has just been to a festival. Now, this is very important. Plato, it's a great book. It's quite a reasonably sized book. And because Socrates speaks a lot, and a lot of the dialogue consists of people going, yes, Socrates. No, Socrates. I think I've made a mistake, Socrates. Yes, Socrates. You know, a lot of it is like that. It's very easy when you first read it to miss the artistry of the dialogue. But there's a lot of art and craft that's gone into it. And in very subtle ways. For example, as I said, Socrates is just coming back from a festival where tributes are being paid to the gods. Can anyone tell me what you know already about Socrates, what that is saying? What is that saying to the reader? You killed a man for not believing in the gods. But here he is coming back from paying tribute to the gods. So you've got it wrong. That's really, it's a very subtle way of saying it. But it's very clever. Okay. So he's gone there, and he's gone there with a bunch of young men. And Socrates used to like to go, because the Greeks would, basically you've got gyms here. The Greeks were very athletic people. And Socrates would go and hang around with the young men while they're doing their push-ups and rubbing each other down with olive oil and glistening in the sun and doing their exercise. Sounds very gay. And let's talk about that for a moment. Homoeroticism in Athens was generally widely accepted. It was generally widely accepted. The practice usually involved an older man and a younger man, and it was a kind of patronage system in which there is degrees of argument about the sexual side of it. I think, reading the Greek text. There's definitely a sexual side of it. There's nothing to me. But there are some people, and as he got older, in his old age when he writes the Laws, it's quite clear that Plato doesn't like the homoerotic culture. So he wants to stand out, he wants to, and there's a kind of beginning even in the classical world. He's not unique in that, but a kind of turning against what was a common cultural practice. And, well, not to be fair or not, one of the things that would separate Plato from the rest of us as moderns, and indeed there's quite a strong current of this in the ancient world, there's a generally prudish quality, suspicion of sex. It's something cultural that some of the philosophers really pick up on. Now, having said that, in the Socratic dialogues, in all the rest of the dialogues, Socrates is clearly very playful, but in none of the dialogues we get the impression, because Alcibiades, who was an important player in the Peloponnesian Wars and seen as treacherous to the Greek cause, as too ambitious and ended up being treacherous, a great soldier, comes into this drinking party where they're discussing the nature of love. And he comes in drunk, and he says how much he loves Socrates and how much he wanted to lie with Socrates, but Socrates took him in his arms all night, but did not do the business, so to speak. And the point of that is very much related, I think, to a really core idea that is developed by Plato, and that is the idea that eros should move from the body to the mind. So eros in and of itself is seen as a good thing by Plato, and this is really spelt out in the Symposium, that dialogue. But it should just be a drive to move you from the body to an understanding of the beautiful itself, from the beautiful body of the beloved to the... So you can see that's very interesting, the good, the true, and the beautiful, which become common stock concepts of the traditional philosophy. They're all laid out here in Plato in different dialogues in important ways. So the beautiful is beautiful only if it's good. It has to be good. And in some ways it has to connect with the truth. They're not identical, but there's some kind of alignment. So when Socrates is coming back from paying tribute to the gods and being at this festival, he's with these young men. This is a way of Plato suggesting that here are these young, ambitious people hanging out with the very ugly Socrates, because that was also an important part of his character, that he was reported to be extremely ugly. And they want to hang out with him because of the beauty of his soul. And although he hangs out with beautiful young men, it's the beauty of their soul that is interesting. And the beautiful part of the soul is the intelligence, not the appetites. In fact, what you get in Plato, which we'll see, is a triadic, three-part breaking down of the soul into the reasonable bit, which he suggests is immortal, the bit that connects the reasonable bit, it's called spiritedness, or thume in Greek, Thume, which connects the reasonable bit to the passionate part of the soul, the irrational part of the soul. So one of the things that we will see in this discussion is essentially an argument for the triumph, or the overwhelming importance that reason should play in one's life, and that should control the passions and unreason. So passion is not bad, but if it's not controlled by reason, it's tyrannical, and you become a host to these forces that you don't wish to be. So he's been with these young guys, and what to do, they're saying. And someone says, let's go back to, I'm sure you've all done this after Chigurh, let's go back to my place, open up some bottles, and let's talk about the nature of justice. Let's have a good discussion about this. Let's have a great philosophical discussion. What a way to spend the evening. And when he goes back there, he's surrounded by a number of people, about 5 or 6 of them. And the father, whose house it is just on his way out to go and pay tribute to the gods. So he's the first person that gets questioned about what is justice. And the point Socrates wants to make is we live in a culture, we live in a society, we live in a city-state where people are very confused about what justice is. They can't define it. So what he will do is he will pick up certain definitions and he will raise problems with them. And this will be the opportunity for him to look at what would be an environment in which justice would be most realized, where the potential, this is Aristotle talk now, but the potential would be most actual, where the potential would be fully realized. That is, what would the most just society look like? But we're living in this society here, which we know it's unjust because they just killed the best man who's ever lived. From Plato's point of view, that's what Socrates is, the best who's ever. So when he asked the old man, who's called Cephalus, C-E-P-H-A-L-U-S, about what is justice, and Cephalus, it comes from the word head. So that's a bit of a, the head of the household is leaving. And he gets him on the way out. And he gives a very traditional answer. And he says, it's obeying one's elders and the tradition. That's a very common kind of argument. I'm doing this because others before me have done it. Now, whether or not Plato is really fair to that argument, or indeed any of the arguments, that's a big philosophical question. I don't need to raise that here. But I'll say that the one point, the central point in the interrogation, because that's how Socrates works, he interrogates people, the central point of the interrogation is, what if the traditions aren't good? Now, he's already, this is part of the craft of the Republic place, so clever, because he's now already identifying the issue of tradition, and what he's going to be doing as the book unfolds is attacking core traditions of Athens. So arguing that Socrates has been killed for all the wrong reasons, I think actually Plato gives you ammunition to say, hell no, they were right. They're upholding their tradition, and that's what they're attacking. And we'll see how radical the Platonic critique of the traditions is, and how radical the alternative he sets up is, by wanting to make reason, intelligence, and philosophy rule the show. The next person to speak up is his son, Polemarchus. And Polemarchus thinks about it and says, I know what it is. It's returning something that you owe. So that's a very contractual kind of idea, isn't it? But if you're given something, it also suggests a kind of mutual obligation. And again, I think that's quite insightful. A lot of people would think that, because you could say it's a variant of neighbourliness. If someone helps you, then you help them. You give that back. But Socrates then says, what if someone gave you something in good faith, but now it's a bit deranged? Say they lent you a knife, And now you know they want to get that knife back to go and do damage. Is that justice? And you go, In that case, it doesn't work. So you've got to have a definition that suits all the cases. So the game is, if I can find something that doesn't fit the definition, then we need to readjust the definition. So that then turns into another proposal, and this proposal is backed up by a poet. And now we're getting the idea we're in an environment where there's festivals for the gods, there's men who are interested in philosophy, there's more traditional ways of thinking about things, and a kind of reflex way of thinking about things will involve repeating what some poet said. And this is going to be a big theme for us, of the importance of the poet in the formation of ancient Greek culture. It's a poetic culture. It's quite unique. We know in other cultures there were poets who were well respected. China, for example, India. But there's something unique about the role the Greeks had. Or to put it bluntly, the equivalent of their kind of sacred texts are poetic texts, and known to be poetic texts because the poets are the voice pieces of those texts. And that's quite different. That's quite unique. And the kind of thing that philosophy is starting to do in Greek is somewhat unique. It's not that philosophy, you can't identify other things very similar to philosophy, but it does take on, for better or for ill, a certain way in ancient Greece that's closely associated with the fact that philosophy is carving itself out, carving out a territory for itself, creating a space for those that do it that will be, to use the word safe spaces now, that will be a safe space for them, because the philosophers are seen as troublesome. And they're seen as being very similar to the sophists, which I mentioned last week. So, when the next argument that comes up, I think it's from Telemachus as well, if I remember, he quotes Simonides, the poet. And he says, justice is helping friends and doing harm to enemies. Now that distinction is a very, very common distinction when one thinks about loyalty within your community and you're thinking about political survival. Indeed, an argument for that definition appears in the 20th century by one of the most important political theorists and legal theorists of the 20th century, who became a Nazi. So the idea that the Nazis, I don't like the Nazis, don't get me wrong, but the idea they were just dumb is dumb. Because the Nazis had amongst them possibly the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, a guy called Martin Heidegger. I might have occasion to speak about him. Hugely influential, at least outside the Anglo-American tradition. His importance is just enormous. He became a Nazi. And the legal theorist, Carl Schmitt. Now, to be fair, both also had enemies within the Nazi party who smelled rats. But nevertheless, they were definitely opportunists. Carl Schmitt, in the book, The Concept of the Political, defines the political as the identification of friends and enemies. Identification of friends and enemies. So you can see that it does tap into, and it's interesting that he was a right-wing Nazi, that a lot of people on the left politically, especially from the 1980s on, long after his, I can't exactly remember what year he died, but if I think he was dead by this stage, but long after he has, ceased to be a Nazi. So it appeals to a certain way of viewing political behaviour. And Socrates simply comes back with the question, but what if your friends are doing wrong? How can you tell them if you're doing wrong? Are you being a good friend to someone if you see them doing wicked things? Do you just stand by them for whatever cost? How about if they're a serial killer, do you keep quiet? He doesn't use that example, but you get the drift. If it involves in larceny, kidnapping, at which point do you say, look, you're my friends and the loyalty matters, but the behaviour is unjust? So, while this is happening, another definition is given, which also we can see variations of it in more modern times. And it's given by a guy who's presented as close to the sophists and the orators, and his name is Thrasymachus. And he is really irritated with Socrates. And it looks like he eventually storms out, so a little unclear. Because one of the things that happens in that, I said Plato's a great craftsman, but there's a few flaws in it. And one of the flaws is that by the end of the dialogue, there's only one other person speaking. So have the rest just gone to sleep? They're all boozed out. They're tired. They can't bear it. Does it show that they're not philosophically spirited enough to keep up with him? Something has happened so that at the end it becomes a two-person show. And that's what the character called Look. And the point that Thrasymachus is making is a point that you see a variation of it in Thomas More and Karl Marx. So much more recently, Thomas More was writing in the early 16th century, Karl Marx, of course, writing in the 19th century. Because if you say justice is just a scam, it's bullshit, and this is what people say who want power, we're doing this because this is just, we're really creating a trick and we're trying to trick you. And that's the position Thrasymachus is on. He's not saying it's a good thing that the rich and the powerful define what justice is. He's saying, no, we can't trust what people say about justice because they're often scoundrels and they have power and they're the ones that speak about it. And given that in the assembly, spoke about that political decisions are made in big groups, democratic groups, hundreds and hundreds of people there, all vying for attention, and those people that are eloquent, that can sway the crowds, were accused, remember me saying this by Aristophanes, of making the weak or the unjust argument look the strong or the just argument. So in a way, Thrasymachus is sensitive to that kind of criticism because he's seeing a lot of bad behaviour. But Socrates answers that surely, if you don't like that, I'm simplifying this. He gives the example of the herdsman with the sheep, and what's the job of the herdsman? Is it to protect the sheep, or is it to look his sheep? Blah, blah, blah. And if he's mistreating the sheep, then that's not a good herdsman. That kind of argument. But the core of this point is that surely what you're objecting to is the way people speak about justice when they're not being just. Now that's got gravity, that argument. There's something to that argument. It's somewhat compelling. So you're not denying that a lot of people misuse the terminology, but he says, if you think, now this is very Platonic, if you think that people will be acting badly, that means you've got an idea about what is good. You've got an idea about what is just, but you're not telling it to me. I asked you what that is. I didn't ask you about what injustice is. I asked you about justice. And so far, in this conversation, I'm seeing a number of arguments which show that people basically haven't got a way to access the idea that we're looking for. Because that's ultimately what he's looking for. He's looking for an idea. Something stable, something true, something visible to the mind's eye, which if the soul is awake, it can literally see it, but internally, not with the outer eye. It can see it through the use of one's own reason, through the use of argument. As that's going along, and we are, I'll repeat, we're reminded that we're dealing with a group of young men that are generally young men, not so sure about as an artist, but who have political ambition, or are wanting to get ahead, and are listening to this old codger, this ugly old codger in his scruffy old toga, enchanting them, but bamboozling them. And one of two brothers, there's a guy called Adamantus, and he said, oh, well, let's look at it this way. How about I concede that justice is a good thing, though he still doesn't know what it is. I concede justice is a good thing, but I concede that in public. What if I could wear what's called the ring of Gyges and make myself invisible at times and get up to all the mischief I wanted when no one can see me? But publicly, I act justly. So what he's getting at there is the reputation that one has of being just. And of course, reputation is going to be important, or is important, in a political career. And I may have said this to you last week, but the Greeks were notorious for turning against their leaders and ostracizing them and kicking them out, which initially meant kicking them out of the city. So they're exiled because they got too big for their boots. So Adamantus is very aware that the Greeks are doing this, and said, well, and he's basically saying, look, it's really hard to do the right thing all the time. What if I can do the wrong thing and get away with it? And Socrates is basically saying, that's a great point. But I've got to now convey to you why justice is really good. So we're looking for something higher now than justice. It's either good or bad. Personally for you, it's going to be a good thing or a bad thing. So how can I convince you that justice in itself is a good thing? And that's starting to shift the discussion away from justice, though it's always there, but towards the idea of goodness or the good. And here's another formulation central to this. I want to talk to you about, this is essentially what Socrates is saying, about the good life. What's a life that will be good? And so he's very aware that one answer would be, I get as much stuff as I can, I have as much power as I can, I have as much control over people as I can, and the best way to do that would be a tyrant. Or I find a life that is so satisfying, I find that way horrible. I'm repelled by that way of being in the world. Not even because of what other people say about it, just because of what it is. So he's raising the question of what are we? But what are we capable of? What is our potential? What is the best that we can be? What is our excellence? So we've hit on this idea about seeming and being, and this is going to be a central theme in Plato that is not just, again, not just related to the search for justice, but about life itself. That there's a difference between the way things look to be and the way things are. But the only way we can get to the way things are, says Socrates, is if we have a method to discover it and we follow that method. It's the only way we can get there. So we're making the distinction between appearances and the thing in itself. That's a very Platonic term, the thing in itself. And then Socrates makes another move, which is why we get a book called The Republic. He makes the move from the micro to the macro, from the personal to the public, from the small to the large. And he's saying, and the figure is very swift, but he's saying, if we just try to understand these personally, we may miss the bigger picture. So let's, instead of going from the small to the big, let's go from the big to the small. So let's look at the quality of soul writ large. And the city-state is the soul writ large. The polis is the Greek word from which we get the word political. The polis and the politis. So what we're now going to do is use our reason, use our argument, use our questions to come up with what will be an ideal. And the word idea, an ideal. So we're going to come up with a conversation that somehow won't contradict the idea of a just state. So we're going to try and find what is a just state. The word for that ideal is utopia. And the word utopia means nowhere. It doesn't exist anywhere. At this stage, it only exists within reason. And we're ultimately going to use that in order to judge what is deficient, in the hope that we may work towards it. So Plato is doing a couple of things here. One is he's identifying it. Sorry. Talking too much. Two. He wants us to find a measure, a measuring stick, that's a yardstick. Now, in some ways, when we get to Aristotle, we'll see that there's a very strong argument against this procedure. And I've taken Plato and Aristotle because they are as the two great representatives of the classical tradition. And we have to realize that Aristotle is Plato's student, but in some ways he creates an alternative philosophy. So we see philosophy, classical philosophy, divided against itself in this way, that we can also see they have a lot in common. Now, the next thing that is going to be central to this, and indeed this is central to how Plato and Socrates reason, and that is that you use the example of where you know you have knowledge against where people just have a belief. Remember me talking about appearance and reality, the way things seem and the way things are. So this introduces another important distinction, which we'll come back to, between opinion and knowledge. So when you think you know something but you don't really know it, for Plato, that's just an opinion. You can have a better opinion and a worse opinion because you might luck onto it. So is knowledge possible? Is driving this question. And what we see is that Plato and Socrates are making an analogy, and one can actually criticize them at this very point, but I won't go into criticism here, I'm making an analogy between what people we know who know, and philosophers who we don't really have the method to know that they know, but I'm going to teach you that method. Because, he's making the argument, it's identical process, essentially the same process. So who are those that know? Who do we know knows stuff? And he said, well, we see this all the time when we see people making things. A carpenter has to know how to make a table, or he's not a good carpenter. Or make a chair. Or a flute maker has to know how to make a flute. And if they can't do it, we know that they're crap. So they need knowledge. And the word that is used then is, again, a word that in my lifetime, much like the word excellence, I saw appear from the wings as if it was hardly there, and now it's central to what your vocabulary, and that is the word skill. There's all sorts of things from universities that's going to teach you skills. I'm very sceptical of that because I have a serious set of philosophical problems with the idea that knowledge and skill completely match up the way Plato thinks it does, but that's neither here nor there for the moment. So what we need is techne, and that's from where we get the word technical or technique. Techne is skill. And someone who makes the flute or the table must be able to convey this knowledge to their apprentices so that the craft keeps going. Moreover, the person that uses the table and uses the flute or the lyre, whatever it is that is made, can see that it's sound. So there's a whole set of tests that come around this. And this is why Socrates was said to hang around with the artisans, the people that made stuff. Because he learnt from them they're doing something really important. And here's the leap, the Platonic Socratic leap. Can't we do that with the soul? How come we can do it with things, but not with the soul? But isn't everything just a thing? And the Platonic way of seeing the world, what is something, ultimately asks after what thing something is. So, and this is a huge difference, because modern philosophers generally don't see the soul as thing-like. Modern philosophers, and we'll talk about this when we move on, whether rightly or wrongly, they tend to see functions. A doing that doesn't mean there's a thing doing it. And another word for that is it may be epiphenomenal. And from that point of view, the soul is an epiphenomenal. The soul is not a thing, but because of all these other things, it appears to be a thing. You can see that's really the opposite of the way Socrates thinks. Socrates is saying it's a thing. So, having taken this idea, he is treating the search for the ideal state in a manner that he will be doing an inquiry into a search to learn how to make a flute or how to make a table or how to make a shoe. You with me there? Go ahead. Okay. And then the next thing, and we'll have a break in a minute now, Socrates then moves from what he sees as the very rudiments of social organisation, the most basic things that people do. And that exists, we know this anthropologically, he's quite right, he's got it right, that before you have a big division of labour, you have a very simple lifestyle. And it's only when you have urban life and empires and trade routes and armies that you see wealthy, luxurious states. Now Socrates indicates that he would be very happy living in a place where everything was very good, and including, he says, and if we lived like this, though this is anthropologically false, but in his argument he puts this up, if we all lived very simply, then no one would be attacking anybody, and there wouldn't be war. As I said, anthropological discoveries show that tribal societies, there's lots of evidence in where people have been buried to show that that's not true for tribal society. Okay, that's how we go. Now, Glaucon, who's the brother of Adeimantus, who then becomes the main guy for the rest of the conversation. And notice there's no women. And let's just briefly talk about that, because I'm very aware in this course how late it is that women start to play any kind of role, as opposed to the exception in some kind of dynastic succession or the occasional philosopher who had very little influence in the bigger tradition. How very male it is and patriarchal. And Athens, as we said last week, was much more patriarchal even than Sparta. There's only one dialogue where there's a woman that instructs Socrates, and she seems to be a divine woman, and that's in the Symposium where she teaches him about love. So women are kept out of this discussion. But we will also see that Plato, in some ways, because of his attraction to the Spartans, is more open than his contemporaries, including his student Aristotle, to women involvement in the possibility of doing philosophy. He is open to this. But the way Athens is structured in this conversation, there's no women. And Glaucon then says to Socrates, and people are living very simply, hand to mouth, finding stuff in this city. He says, this is the city of pigs. And I don't want to live in such a city. This is just... Because to live like that would mean you would have to leave the city. Now, there were a group of philosophers. In fact, there were a couple of groups of philosophers that emphasized simplicity so much. The Cynics were one. You remember me talking about him last week. And he was a cynic living in a barrel. And then later would be the followers of Epicurus, from which you get the word Epicurean, and most people think that means great cooking, when it means the opposite. The Epicureans meant simplicity, really simple, and they withdrew from public life and found little communities where they lived very simply. And it's quite clear that they can trace themselves back to certain things Socrates was saying. And in fact, Socrates can trace himself back to the Pythagorean community. So there are examples of philosophical communities living with great simplicity. But Socrates says, okay, I get it. This is too much for you. Let's open up the floodgates. Let's let wealth in. And then there's going to be war. We've got to deal with that. But even though he does that, what he still conjures up, and this is really a conjuration, what he conjures up is still going to be much, much more simpler than what Athenian life was actually like. So there's something very aesthetic. The aesthetic, you know, not having the senses overburden you in this way of thinking. And that's because Plato sees wealth as a corrupting force. And now, I'll have a break now for 10 minutes. Let's just stretch your legs, and then I'll come back to the triadic city that he sets up. Now, given that Plato's Socrates in the Republic has indicated that he sees wealth as corrupting the soul, and what we picked up about the danger of wanting to appear to be just while actually being unjust, was this idea of corruption is very important in this work. And what we're looking for, or what Socrates is looking for, is a just society, one in which corruption is eradicated. Because this is meant to be an ideal. It's meant to be something really great that everybody will do. So what he then does, he makes an analogy between the nature of the soul, as he sees it, which, again, that no one really picks him up on this, the context of it. But he makes an analogy between the nature of the soul and different classes that are required to have a well-ordered city. So the idea of a well-ordered soul, a well-ordered city, they're parallel or analogous to each other. And he says there's three essential classes. The guardians, and they are representative or emblematic of wisdom and intelligence. And the greatest of these will be the philosophers, so the wisest and most intelligent will be the philosophers. There's the auxiliaries, which are often translated as watchdogs or soldiers, and their job, so it's quite hierarchical, it's very hierarchical, and it's along the lines of the kind of military model that also fits this triadic view of the soul. And they correspond to that part of the soul, which we call the spirited part. It's the will or desire that is serving the intellect. And they require courage to do that. They have to be courageous enough to observe what is going on beneath that's wrong, report back up, but help preserve the order. So they have a role in preserving it. Because the guardians, they're not really preserving it. They're studying and understanding what is needed. And then you've just got the producers and the craftsmen. And there's very, very little about them in the Republic. We can see he's not really interested in those groups. And they are people who are driven, in this term, by appetite. And appetite is not reason. But given that the city is going to be conforming to the vision of the and narrative of the guardians, it'll be important that their desires are modified. So it's not a get-rich place, this place. They are there to produce the basics that are needed for the reproduction of the city. There's another principle that Socrates draws upon in the Republic, which Aristotle will dispute the value of this, or validity of this principle, and that is the idea that each person is best fitted to do, or best suited to do one main thing. So, one person should have one task. So you can see it's a very uniform kind of society. Uniform at three levels. Thank you. Now, right from the beginning, when it comes to education, so education is central to this. This is also why the Republic is also considered the first great work in the philosophy of education. It's not only the first great work in political philosophy, but it's in educational philosophy. And if you were studying education and you did a subject called philosophy of education, you would definitely be studying the Republic. And right from the beginning, Socrates wants to address the fact that he sees that the two traditional models which set the standard for how we should act, because they come from poets, are fundamentally deficient. They're no good. And immediately, Plato sets the task up that the guardians will need to have their literature censored. So he's now taking on the great power brokers of ancient Greece, who were the poets, as I said earlier. In the law courts in ancient Athens, one of the things that was constantly done if you were trying to sway people was quote the great poets. And the greatest two poets are Homer and Hesiod. But as the poets make their way in the world and become sufficiently important, it also includes the tragic dramatists. That's a much later innovation. That's people like Aeschylus and Sophocles, the two greatest, of whose work we still have something. And Plato then goes through examples from Homer, who's the earliest of them, whose two great works. Can anyone tell me the works of Homer? Odyssey and the Iliad. One is about war, one is about homecoming. But they are both representative of the heroic life. But they also depict the gods in their interaction. The other is Hesiod. Now, I think Plato is particularly unfair to Hesiod. And let me just clarify that for a moment. I think it is important. And in fact, so important, I would go so far as to say that the critique of the poets and the gods, which we find before Socrates, I mentioned this last week in the work of Xenophanes, for example, but that critique in many ways owes a lot to Hesiod. Hesiod wrote two great works. One is called the Theogony, and it's about the birth of the gods. And basically that work is a horror show of struggle in which Zeus finally emerges as triumphant. And Zeus emerges as an all-seeing, all-knowing, just, wise God who protects the wretched and the weak, etc., and who hates injustice. And you don't really get a sense of that in Plato's depiction of Hesiod. Hesiod's other work is called Works and Days, and it's basically a kind of instruction manual for what was then predominantly an agrarian community, and the city-state builds itself after this agrarian community has formed, and they take the stuff to market. This is the way cities always get emerged. And it's not only an instructional manual about what to do, but it's about how to behave. And it's a very moralistic little book. And there's very little that Hesiod actually says that really is a great contradiction to Plato. And also Zeus figures in there as well. It's very important. Now this idea of an all-knowing, all-seeing God is something that is going to become part and parcel of the philosophical view of the gods. So it does go back to the poets, but the way Hesiod is still speaking in an anthropomorphical way, that is, human figure. But the qualities that are being ascribed to Zeus by him, you can see there's already a departure. And where we're going with Plato is the idea that intelligence itself is divine. Intelligence is divine. So he takes on board the fact that he knows that the poets are the great educators, that people repeat them because they tell the stories, and the purpose of the stories was to provide moral instruction in the case of Hesiod, or in the case of Homer, to get people to reflect upon the audiences that were listening to what we call the rhapsodes, who would come and basically recite these very, and as you know, the Homer and the Odyssey and the Iliad are very long work of poetry. It takes days to recite them. So people would sit there and listen to these stories, and they get some idea of what to do, how to behave, even though the behaviour of the heroes, and the gods even in Homer, is not very moral in this philosophical sense that we're looking at. So a number of things happen here. First is we've got to get rid of what the poet said. We've got to clean up the act. Now here's a word that you're all familiar with, and it's a Platonic notion, and that is the idea of a role model. Again, I witnessed that word come into being as a word in serious pedagogical circulation, starting around the 1970s. Prior to that, not many people were talking about role models. But insofar as you could say education is trying to cultivate, perhaps it was just a question of time for the word to come into vogue in educational circles. But Plato is saying we are the kind of creatures that model ourselves on examples, and the two greatest examples are what the gods do and what the heroes do. And if the heroes, as everybody knows the story of Achilles, is acting badly, and Odysseus might be said to be acting badly in all sorts of ways, we can identify all these qualities in the heroes which we think are defective and deficient if we want to have good people. So what Plato then does, he redefines the hero so that Socrates is the hero. He's the new Achilles. And if you know the story of the Iliad, the essential story about Achilles was that after being shamed by Agamemnon, he withdrew from the war, got very angry, went into a rage, watched all his comrades be killed, and then when his dearest friend Patroclus was killed, re-enters the war and acts violently and viciously within the war, but also helps end the war because of his prowess. So by Plato making Socrates to be the new Achilles, and he actually does that in the Apology, that we can see this is, now we're seeing the new Achilles at work in the Republic. We can see he's completely upended, turned on its head, the kind of qualities, heroic qualities, that were needed and appreciated by the Greeks. But it is important that Socrates himself is reputed to be a good warrior, and that also comes out of the Apology. So clearly Socrates, or Plato's Socrates, or Plato himself, see that it is important that certain warrior values are retained, but above all, if I'm to put it on one thing, if you go through, when you read Book 3 and 4 of the Republic, where you see the critique, you'll see that Plato is focusing upon excessive behaviour in temperament. It could be laughing, it could be weeping, it could be getting angry. But any of these things take away from the poise and equanimity, the balance, the temperance, the measure of the man, and the measure of the soul. So Socrates is speaking to those who he would like to see cultivate this quality of measure within the soul, and in doing that, they have to cast off all the influences that would lead them to wild and erratic, passionate behaviour. So the hero must be wise, just, courageous, tempered, balanced, reasoning. The other thing that gets redefined, and this again helps us see why the trial of Socrates actually had legs, in spite of what Plato's depiction indicates. It's a critique of the Homeric, and I should have put Hesiodic pantheon. And indeed, although we have an antecedent, as I said, in Xenophanes, it's redefining the god in such a way, and we can say this is the first real work of theology, which is a logos about the gods, and that's the first time we are aware of the word, is in the Republic. That word is used, theology is used. Now, let's momentarily contrast this with the biblical God. And we'll quickly see that from the Platonic point of view, the biblical God ain't really a God. Why do we know that? We know enough about the Bible to know that he gets very angry. He weeps and wails, he gets upset. He's wrathful, he punishes. He can change form. It's still very anthropomorphic, the Jewish God, and even the Christian God. So, what Plato says is, first of all, there's a whole number of things that have to go if a God really is perfect. Note this. You've got the definition, you've got the idea in your head about what a God should be. You can see the gigantic shift of emphasis. And this is a complete breaking with everything we know anthropologically about all other societies. A complete breaking. But God cannot change form. Why not? Because if a God changed form, that would mean it went from one state to another, in which case, where's the perfection? So if the God is perfect, then there can't be any change. It must be immutable. It must be implacable. It must be eternal. Hence, sacrifice is completely irrelevant. Because sacrifice requires some kind of intercession by the God, or intervention by the God, because of your supplication, because you've given it. Again, that suggests that God is in need. Now, the Jewish God is in need. Absolutely true. And there's a great Jewish thinker of the 20th century, I might have mentioned him last week, a man called Franz Rosenzweig, who said, yes, the God of the Bible is not only seeking redemption for his creatures, but is caught up in this process of redemption. So God is seeking redemption of all, including himself. That's a very wild twist. But the only reason I mention it, it shows you how contrary to Greek theology that way of thinking is. And this becomes very important later when we start talking about Christendom and Christian societies, where philosophy is nibbling around the edges, but it's never really at the centre until much, much later. But then the philosophy you get will be generally quite anti-Platonic or very little, a couple of exceptions. So it's in need of nothing. It's protection. So that's a very important part of the Republic, and it occurs early on. And what Plato will also do is provide a whole education system of what is required for the guardians. And that education system involves subjects like music, so they can learn harmony, and he also wants to... I'm laughing because I'm thinking of what he would think of heavy metal, because he's complaining there about the lyre players and what a racket they're making if they're using certain scales. And it's like, I can't bear it. But you can barely hear it. So if you heard death metal or something, or I'm too old to know the genres now, but a whole lot of stuff that we have would say this is all destructive of the soul, because all of this influences the soul. And if you're stirring up the appetites, you're doing harm. So astronomy is very important. In fact, in the laws, Plato suggests that the planetary movements are divine movements, so the stars are gods. What else? Well, I'll come back to the most important philosophy itself, what's involved in that training. But you've got astronomy, you've got music, you've got gymnastics. Remember, that other side has to be catered for. You've got mathematics. It's very important in the education. So you've got a whole educational system required for this cultivation. But then in Book 10, which is the last book, he returns to the critique of the poets, because he realizes that banning the poets from this city, or censoring them, and ultimately you're banning them, is a very radical thing. And then he zooms in on what he sees as what's behind it all. and that is method. Now, the word method is from the Greek metapodos, and that's to go along a way. So the idea is that to philosophize is you have to go along the way that leads to the ideas. There's a path, there's a way to do it. And he says the problem with the poets, which we've seen in books 3 and 4 of the examples they give, they're no good, but there's actually a methodological problem. And he's saying the poets literally don't know what they're talking about. The poet just represents the things that they have some insight into, some glimpse of. They're just getting glimpses of things. How can we trust people to educate us who only have glimpses into things? Whereas the philosophers see the things themselves. The poets are only dealing in appearances. The philosophers have the method to get to the things themselves. And indeed, he puts the sophists, the wise guys, the orators, statesmen, and the poets now, all into one group who are dealing in shadows. They've all just got glimpses of things. They all are the power brokers of our political experience and our the polity. Now, we recall, I mentioned Aristophanes, how he had presented Socrates as a sophist. And the sophist went round teaching people how to speak, how to recite poetry, how to remember things for their own political gain. And they were paid money. Socrates never takes a fee. That's very important as far as Plato is concerned. The truth is its own reward. So, whereas Aristophanes then has criticised the sophists and the poets and put them in the one camp, philosophers, the sophists and the philosophers. Plato is saying the philosophers are the antithesis to the sophists, and the sophists, which you're seeing now because they're all over the place now, and they are causing trouble, and a lot of people hate them. And a lot of political people, statesmen and traditionalists hate them. So Plato is wanting, in a sense, to ingratiating himself with the rest of the community by saying, the problem is that these people are just like the poets. And what you think is the best and the worst, they're equally, in their own way, bad. They're equally misleading. I mentioned that about the living. Now, 3 important points here. First of all, Plato raises the idea that property, I should have said that, property is of so little importance to a ruler, or should be of so little importance, because what they have is the best thing, knowledge and wisdom and virtue, is of so little importance that for the guardians, not for the lower classes, but for the guardians, property should be held in common, the family should be abolished, and I must say the abolition of the family becomes quite a constant in the development of utopian literature. And we know that the family originally exists as a means of passing on property. That's its primary and original social function. But what you and yours have spent a lifetime doing is not just going to disappear when you die. You pass it on as inheritance. And then the next thing is there's the equality of women. And he basically argues if women have the wherewithal, the ability and the talent, then they too can be philosophers. Now, in some other dialogues, Plato presents the position of women as very unfortunate. And to be fair, in Greece it was an unfortunate position in terms of the laws that surrounded women. In fact, other parts of Western society, whether it's Rome or whether it's Christendom, women had far more liberties than they did in Athens. Athens was particularly constraining of women. There were some exceptions, For example, Pericles used to hang around with a courtesan. He was very famous. I've even seen someone say that the model for Diotima in the Symposium, the woman that teaches, comes from Pericles' consort. But I think that's just completely made up and speculative. There's no real proof for that. So the other thing that then occurs is women, if there's to be no family, if property is to be held in common, women are equal, at least in this sense, that they can be rulers. But you can see it's very different from modern equality. It's very different from the argument that women don't get as much as men, therefore women should get more. That's a very different kind of argument. You've got a very different way of viewing the world. So in this sense, it's not really a precursor to the more modern bourgeois society, acquisitive, we want stuff. We can make stuff, we should get it, we have a right and entitled to it if we make it. This is, and he's not aware of that, obviously, but this is a completely different kind of narrative. So the question is, what about reproduction? And Plato answers, every so often, there will be festivals which men and women just get together. Now, one of the problems is going to be, and Aristotle will raise all this, because Aristotle doesn't like this at all. One of the issues will be, well, what about the children? Whose are they? How do you know? And is there going to be a point in which incest is likely? And is this dangerous? Now, this is kind of touched upon, but not really dealt with. And then there's another problem, which Plato says, occasionally, maybe some really smart kids are born in the lower classes. And maybe we end up with some real dummies in our lot. And there's a section on the Republic where you can see they're trafficking in children, swapping them over. And this, I think, is a very interesting insight into the technocratic mind. And in this sense, I think Plato is a very early technocrat. That is, you come up with an idea, and then you really want that. So instead of looking at the way things evolve, because the way it has evolved over time is you just see all the mistakes and all the bad stuff. So then you try and rectify this, but you end up with a whole other set of problems. So, and the other thing is I mentioned that Socrates is very aesthetic. Socrates conceives in the Republic these mating periods of time in a very functionalist, technocratic way for the good of the whole society, and people aren't to get too close to each other emotionally like that, because they shouldn't be loving each other. They should be loving the ideas. They should be loving wisdom. They should be loving the city. You could see one way of saying this, and I'm not going to use Platonic language now. I'll say this is the love of the abstract over the lived. But it's all part and parcel of trying to curb desire. So curb the instincts, curb the irrational. And so the sexual side of life is very minimalist, and it's purely for profligate purposes. Now, I want us to take it back now to the center of the method, and I'm going to talk about two analogies which are, in a way, the center of the theory of knowledge and the nature of knowledge as expressed by Plato in the Republic. The first is called the allegory of the cave, and it's an allegory which, again, if you study philosophy of education, you probably learn in your first week. And Plato gives a picture of the human condition, and it goes like this. Imagine we're all in a cave and we're all bound. And at the front of the cave there's a fire, and there's a sun outside, and there's people and carts and animals walking up and down. But because you can't see them, you're just seeing shadows on the wall. But imagine one of the people inside breaks the bonds, makes their way up to the top, slowly gets their eyes to adjust, sees the fire and then the sun that illuminates everything, sees the people, see what's going on. And then they go back into the cave and say, look, it's not the shadows. These are but shadows. They're not real. They're just the appearances. Outside is where the reality is. And if you want to know what's going on, you need to go outside. Can you see the difference between appearance and knowledge is summed up in that analogy or allegory? So if we want to understand the truth of things, then we must look beyond the appearances. We must move away from what people generally say and speak about things, because people aren't seeing things. They're only seeing the shadows of things. You can see how this ties up to the critique of the prophets as well, and the sophists and all the others. So the next analogy I want to talk about is what's called the analogy of the divided line. So we have the distinction between what he calls the visible things and those invisible things which are accessible to the mind, to the thoughtful mind, the inquiring mind. And the visible things are the things of appearances. And we can have two kinds of things. We can have a distorted image. For example, if you put a stick in water and it bends, that's a distorted image. So in certain environments, like where you don't have sufficient light, you can only see the shadows. There you have the images of things. And for Plato, that's exactly what happens when you don't see all the things. And that's what the poets are doing. They're only seeing these imaginings. They imagine things. But when you see visible things, you've got a belief about them. So I talk to you, I've met Chris a number of times in classes, so I have the idea that I know him. I'm using the word idea now, not something frivolous, but of course I don't really know him. It will take a lot of information to know you. And in fact, do we even know ourselves? So that's another question. We don't know what we're capable of. But you can see this is what he's getting at. So belief is akin to thinking you know it because you've seen it. But you haven't really developed a more comprehensive understanding. And then he divides the world into the intelligible. And his example is mathematical objects. And if, for example, I was teaching you, God forbid, but if I was teaching you my grade 3, probably not even that anymore, maybe grade 1 level of mathematics, and I was going to talk to you about triangles and right angle triangles and walk you through the Pythagorean theorem, I would draw that on the board. I would make an image of that. So, but we would look at the image, if I was a teacher, of the triangle, and then I'd walk you through why it amounts to 180 degrees all the ends. You would know that the triangle I've drawn, if I were to have perfect measurement tools, that because of the nature of my drawing and the board itself, and it wouldn't really be 180 degrees. But that doesn't change the nature of the theorem around a mathematical object. So that's, he says, so when you objectify something in that way, when you give an example of something, you're still thinking, and everyone's activated by their thinking, but you're still trying to represent it in some way, but you know that you've got to look behind the representation to follow me in the train of thought. And then he makes the next step. He says, but there's some things that we can know, which is what philosophical knowledge devotes itself to,
Well, we can't draw that. I can't draw a wise man. You know, me drawing a picture of someone doesn't help you understand in any way the qualities of wisdom. You just see the ugly Socrates, and I'm going to tell you, you're beautiful. He's beautiful of soul. The picture's not going to help. So, when we have knowledge, we have episteme knowledge. And we have it, he says, of forms. And Plato says everything has a form. But the form, and he's using this in a very different way when we get to Aristotle, because Aristotle basically rejects the logos. But the form is what the mind sees, not what the eye sees. So if I wish to define the nature of being human, it's no use me looking at any one of you to take my orientation from that. I have to have an hypothesis and a definition, and then I have to interrogate that hypothesis, and I see that all the different possible subspecies of the overarching species are going to be able to fit. Now you notice, of course, that will mean that the form, in many ways, is a lot less contentful than the example. So if I speak of a form of human being, am I talking about someone who is disabled or who is well spoken or poorly spoken, or how do I capture that? Now, I think that is actually much more difficult than Plato is really able to convince himself. And I think that's why Aristotle teaches it. But nevertheless, that is essentially the point. And to be fair to Plato, to some extent we do speak that way. To a large extent we do speak that way. So if I'm saying, you know, human beings should have rights, or human beings should treat each other, so I'm using moral language, should treat each other with respect. I'm not talking about this human being, I'm not talking about Wendy or Mary or Joe or Fred. I'm talking at another level of generality where there's a truth claim being made that you want all to recognize. So that's what the form does. It enables you to see, in a sense, the bigger picture with the mind's eye. And then he says the most important of all the forms is the good. Because the only reason we want knowledge is because we believe knowledge is preferable to ignorance. Knowledge is preferable to ignorance. I remember a philosopher friend of mine in his cups one day. See, I do philosophy, but I do it in political science, so philosophers don't really recognize people like me as doing philosophy, even though I publish it, because the questions I ask sort of shift away from their questions. I remember him putting his hands on his face and going, you know, Wayne, I'm really not sure if the philosophical life, that is the unexamined life, is the best life. And I erupted into laughter, and I just said, well, there's a million people I'd like to be besides philosophers. You know, I love music, so I would rather, you know, if I could live a life like Bob Dylan, I'd infinitely prefer that than living a life like Plato, playing music or being an artist of some sort. But we can see the way Plato has depicted art. Art is purely there in service to ideas. Now, by the way, I have to say that this way I think is very infectious, and we know it's very infectious because every time you see people moralizing about art, you can't do that. That is, in some way, that's harming someone, or that's representing someone. They're thinking very platonically. They may not have thought it through very much. In fact, most people who take stands on things, their philosophical amount of time that they've invested, or the amount of time they've invested into really thinking something through is often very negligent. They just say, no, do that. And in a sense, that's the kind of thing that Plato is trying to curb. But nevertheless, if you think that art should serve
a social and political purpose, and a lot of people today think that, in some way you're very close to Plato. And in a long discussion we would see whether you'll escape the problems that Plato ends up in, or whether you've really solved that. I think if you do that, you really are a Platonist in that respect. And then there are those, Charles Baudelaire, a poet I've written a book on with a friend of mine, argued art should be for its own sake. That as soon as you try to make it fit a moral and social purpose, you will distort what it can do. And you'll actually defigure our exploration of what human beings are. Now, I do at least want to finish Plato today. I had hoped to get to Aristotle. I'll make it up. I will get there through everything, of course. Chris knows the way I teach. Now, one of the things about the Republic is how to set it up. And Plato indicates that although he's got this great idea, exactly how to set it up. Because if you've got adults, you're going to have people that have got a bad education right from the start. So he's diffused out of that idea, city-state, to address other issues by saying, maybe we need a bunch of 10-year-olds. We just need the people to hand over the 10-year-olds, and then we'll educate them, and then we can take off. So you see there's a serious problem here. And indeed, there's a number of problems with the idea philosophers should be king. The greatest is, why would they want to? And the answer that is given to philosophers being kings, why they should rule, the standard best, is if they don't, someone worse will do it. So they do it out of a sense of desire to make the world better rather than worse, and their world better rather than worse. And you could say it's to make them safer. There is an argument to be held for that. But he eventually moves out of that, and you can see Plato returns to the question of what's the best kind of state in two other dialogues. One is called the Statesman, and one is called the Laws. And you can see that he concedes that having a philosopher king might be impossible. And indeed, there was a story that there was a tyrant in Sicily, or a king in Sicily, who thought a lot of Plato and begged him to come to the kingdom. His name was Dionysus, and teach him and instruct him in philosophy so he should be a better ruler. And Plato hated it there, and he ended up thinking that Dionysus was impossible to teach philosophy to. He was too apathetically driven, and he left. And the story is that forces Plato to change his mind. But in the Statesman, it's made very clear that perhaps it's impossible. So maybe the best thing is for philosophers in some way to impact upon those that will make law. And that's what and in the Laws, we see this Athenian stranger try and draft a constitution for other people to live in. So the laws then become as philosophical as possible. And this is a very important point. Across the ages now, once you have a more philosophical culture, you will start to find a real congruence between philosophy and law. That people who teach ethics, for example, will very often want the law to express what it is that they believe that philosophically discovered about ethical behaviour. So the law then becomes an instrument to try and cultivate. So it moves from there, and then Plato looks at other constitutions, and first of all, he recognises that nothing in the world is stable. The forms are stable, but the world is not. And he said, eventually this will break down, even if you could set it up. And first of all, the ideal will be the rule of the best, and what is likely to happen. And now he's drawing upon sociological and historical insights that he's had. He says, well, they'll probably lead to people who are honourable but not so smart. But then their children will probably want to make money, and that will lead to the rule of the oligarchs. And as they then become caught up in making money, then other people will want their rights recognised. And this will lead to the rule of appetites and democracy. He's very critical of democracy, though he does ultimately think a mixed constitution is probably the best you can get.
So you will have some democratic features, some aristocratic features, and you've got to take into account there'll be democratic and democratic features. And the worst is going to be tyranny. And he sees that there's a really close connection between democracy and tyranny. And in fact, that's true. Historically, we can give lots and lots of examples of, this is one reason I must say that I do not accept that the democracy that we have now is bound to stay forever. Because all the experiments in democracy have always been relatively short-lived. And if we go back even to the city-states in Republican Italy, or in the city republics in Italy, which were quasi-democratic in their way, going back to the 16th, 15th century, you can see countless examples of client state organizations being set up, or clientism being set up. And you see it too, I mean, dynastic families. That's not an uncommon phenomenon in democracies, the Clintons and the Bushes in the United States, for example. But that's a long way. So, ultimately, he divides in the Statesman and the Laws. There's the better and the worse constitutions. The better would be a monarchy, someone who's wise, but one. The worst would be a tyranny, someone who's won but lacking all wisdom. An aristocracy, the rule of the best, which is the kind of people that he gathers around him. Socrates are members of aristocratic families. They're cultivated a certain way. The rich, who don't really care about all that stuff, they just want money. And then you've got democracy with law and democracy without law. And democracy without law is basically what he sees happens as well. And running through this is basically the life of reason versus the life of the tyrant. And tyranny is the affliction of the Greeks. I mentioned the Gorgias, and what the Republic wants to show is Socrates is better than any kind of tyrant. And you young men, stay away from those tyrants. They'll fill you up with appetite and make you and the city miserable. The Republic then concludes with a story about immortality. And the story goes that the universe is cosmically ordered and that the soul is immortal, but the soul learns along its way, and all these deficiencies in this world impede that order. But if the philosophers are able to live that life, even if the world they live in is not so great, in the next life, there is improvement. Now this will become, there's a lot of people who write on Plato who this isn't very important for. But there's a big tradition that comes out of Platonism called the Neoplatonic tradition. And this more mystical, you could call it religious stuff, becomes really important to them. And they have a huge influence within Christendom and indeed even in the Islamic world, which is that's a whole other fascinating story. And I think that if you look at the Sufis, you'll see that they've been affected by the Neoplatons. Their faith in reason, rational inquiry, belief reason can achieve harmony, and if it doesn't do it in this life because the soul is immortal, you will go on to eventually be at one again with reason itself. You will return to the original impressions. Okay, I will call it a day here. I'll get to Aristotle next week, and I'll find some way over the next few weeks to bring everything back on board. Do we have any questions? Okay, I'll cease the recording now, and I'll see you next week.